welcome to Fun Problems, the problems of fun. I'm Peter C. Hayward.
And I'm AJ Brandon.
And today we have brought the harbinger of death. Alex Cutler is our special guest. Now, Alex, why are you the harbinger of death?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, I started Kill Little when I was just a young man. I don't know how to respond to that intro.
So many years ago, we had Alex as our first ever guest with three of us on the show. And we ran into more editing issues with that episode than I think anything I've ever edited in my life put together. We went through how many editors, AJ, including you and me?
Oh, I think literally 6 plus.
Yeah. And eventually, so the podcast slowed down for a while, and that is entirely Alex's fault, just to be clear. We take no responsibility whatsoever. It was all Alex.
Yeah, if I recall correctly, you were staying with me at the time, and we couldn't figure out how to record in the same room in any way that made sense, so we were like through the wall from each other. So like I could hear you like muffled murmuring while I was going and vice versa.
And then we actually probably could edit that episode, but A, we don't want to because it was such a, like, the episode itself was nice. It was the editing process that was a nightmare. And B, it's been so long that like almost everything that is now out of date. It like opened with you being like, yeah, I just had a baby. And now he's what, 17, 18?
Yeah. 5, but might as well be 17. Yeah, it's been a long time since I was attempted to be on the show. Yeah.
So it's very lovely to have you back. For those who don't know the fabulous Alex Cutler, or have never listened to me rave about you in like half of our episodes, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself? Please do not tell us that when you're a kid you played Monopoly and Risk, because I hate that answer. Every board game podcast is like, how'd you get into gaming? And it's always like, I played Monopoly and Risk as a kid, and then I found other games.
Right, so anyway, I was playing Scrabble and chess, and I did play Monopoly and Risk, but I will not talk about that now. Okay. So good chat.
And that's the end of the episode. Thanks everyone so much for listening. This has been a delight to have you back. Hopefully this one has no tech issues.
So I'm Alex Cutler. I know Peter very well, so I'm entirely able to deal with whatever he throws at me during this. So I am a game designer and developer. I was the head of development at Pandasaurus Games for about 3 years, and then about 6 months ago, I went full-time into being a freelance designer because I had a lot of luck getting things signed and decided that I wanted to focus more on the design side than the development side, but I do still do both.
Alex is my frequent collaborator. We have, I think we counted today, 3 signed games together, including one that is our first one is just about to actually land to people, Critter Kitchen, which, again, if you've heard the show, or if you're AJ, you've heard me talk about endlessly. And I don't know why it's doing that. So we wanted to get Alex on because today's episode is about collaboration. I think board game is probably one of the most, probably not the most, but one of the most collaborative mediums. A lot of designs are by more than one designer, including a lot of mine, actually all of AJ's. No, AJ, you've got some solo designs, don't you?
I've got loads of solo designs, but
and a lot of Alex's. Again, we've all designed solo, we've all designed collaboratively, and I have worked with both Alex and AJ. You two are my main 2 collaborators, so we thought it would be great to get Alex on and talk about the pitfalls, the benefits, the everything to do with collaborating.
Mm-hmm.
AJ, take us away.
Sorry, real quick.
Alex, take us away.
Just so we don't lose another episode. Your guys' video is freezing a bit for me. I don't know if I'm freezing a bit for you. If it looks okay on your end, we can keep going. But I just wanted to flag that so that we don't record for an hour and then you say, actually, there was a problem.
So my computer is just sporadically freezing a little bit. I think that's what's happening. Let me, while AJ talks, I'm going to close some windows and see if that helps.
Sounds good. I was noticing that on Peer too. So the first thing I want to talk about is who we collaborate with and how is it different collaborating with different people? Because I think a lot of the things that are going to come up in this conversation are sort of going to be framed differently based off of which of the co-designs we're talking about. So Alex, obviously you do a lot of co-design with Peter. Do you co-design with anybody else? And with co-designing with each of those people, how does that differ, and how does that differ from design solo?
Yeah, so I've co-designed. I was thinking about it before the show. I've got co-designs either signed or published with about 4 or 5 different people now. And Peter is probably the person I work with the most in terms of total hours. The other person I work with a lot is a guy named Mike Mihalsik, who is a designer who did like Shadowblade's Banner Festival and a few other Flotilla was, I believe, him and JB Howell. And he's great. He's in my local group. So I live in North Carolina right now. And so him and I are able to get together pretty frequently. Peter, I would get together with a lot more, except he's out in LA. So we're kind of doing the thing right now where it's 2 trips a year, one of us going out to see the other one.
For our non-American listeners, North Carolina is the state directly north of California. That's why it's called North Carolina. Carolina is the old Latin term for California.
Well, the original name for California was South North Carolina, so it's, as we all know.
I'm learning so much about American geography.
And directly south of that is Canada, which is great for AJ to come up and see Peter. So,
if we all stand in the right spot, we create a perfect vertical line.
That's right. Yeah, it's like our own little Stonehenge. So the second part of your question, AJ, was how does it differ between like co-design versus solo design? So working with different people, the experience for me has been very positive. I would say at this point in my career, pretty much everything I do is a co-design. I still often will start at a solo place, but inevitably I take the idea, and as I'm talking to Peter or talking to Mike or someone else, we'll sort of start spitballing, and inevitably it sort of becomes this kind of collaborative process. I'm like, let's just make a co-design because we're both excited about this idea. I think probably like 3 or 4 times a year, I'll go to my local group with a solo design. And then over the course of the evening of playing it and then talking with Mike or someone else there, I'll be like, do you want to just work on this together? Because this, I like what you said. And as someone who has 2 young children, I've got the aforementioned 5-year-old and an almost 2-year-old. And as someone who doesn't have quite as much free time as I would like to for working on designs, having a collaborator is often an incredible way to maximize the time and energy you're able to put into something and have someone to sort of keep you on task and keep you invested in a project.
Same question for Peter.
So I have an internal model of co-design, which is obviously it's different. Like, sometimes it's 51-49 for this model that I'm talking about, which is that generally one person does sort of the dirty work and one person does more of the ideas. So with AJ and I, for example, I would say you do a lot more of the dirty work. You do the updating of the TTS and the this and the that, which I hate doing. Whereas with Alex, conversely, I tend to be the one updating the stuff. And that's not to say that, both people are involved in all the stuff, people having ideas, et cetera, et cetera. But I do find it just becomes easier if one person is sort of more hands-on than the other. Just because, let's say I'm printing a physical prototype and I need to print another one, I already have the files. Whereas if I print a physical prototype and then AJ needs to print the next one, he's not going to have them. Like, it's going to be this whole, like, well, I need to source this piece and that piece. So generally speaking, I would say the biggest difference between my collaborations is just who's doing the, I want to say dirty work. You know what I'm trying to say? Like the bitsy work.
And I think that a lot of that just leans into determining who's doing what, which was a future point that I had on here. When I'm co-designing with you, I do different work than when I co-design with other people. Like with you, you do most of the Component Studio updating stuff because you're very, very proficient with Component Studio. With all my other co-designs, I think, I'm usually the one who's more proficient with Component Studio, so I do all that. And like you said with us, I end up doing a lot of the tabletop simulator updates. You often do a little bit more of the rulebook stuff. So it is a bit of a give and take. But I think the important thing to making sure that it feels fair to both people is identifying what stuff each of you are happy doing, which stuff each of you is not happy doing, right?
Yeah, I am always the Component Studio guy because, in fact, it is mandatory that if you're working with me, we work in Component Studio. Like, I have people be like, hey, we should make something together. I'm like, if I'm interested, I'll say yes, but it does come with a condition. I guess 2 conditions, which is that I negotiate the contract and I get all the royalties and you get none. No, I negotiate the contract because I'm a very fierce negotiator. I think you'll both agree with that. And I do the Component Studio, and it has to be on Component Studio because I don't ever want to design off, not a sponsor. I live in that program. In our Christmas episode, I showed in the YouTube video just some of the truly ridiculous things I can now do in that program. Unnecessary ridiculous things, but like for everything I'm doing, that's where I want the master files to be. That's where I want everything to be. So Component Studio is how I prototype. So if you want to collaborate with me, it's got to be through Component Studio. That's sort of my hard and fast rule. And then AJ, you mentioned that when we work together, you tend to do the TTS mods. I hate putting stuff on TTS. I hate it. But I realized that I've actually always done the physical prototypes for our games.
That's true. Yeah,
which
absolutely.
is an interesting. That's not a common split, I don't think necessarily.
But that's something that I really hate. I really hate doing the physical prototypes. I don't really mind doing the TTS ones. Fantastic. We both find our lane. And I think there's this classic advice of every partnership works best when you both feel like you're doing less than half of the work. And the way that you make that happen is by doing the stuff that you're really good at or that you enjoy and getting the other person to do the other stuff. And I would imagine that all the partnerships that fall apart because both of you hate doing the physical prototype and you're like, I don't want to do this.
It's so funny because I thought you were going to go in the opposite direction. I heard a guide for like co-inhabiting or marriage, which is that both people should strive to do more than half the work and then it'll be equitable.
Right.
Which is sort of the exact opposite in an interesting way.
Yeah, that makes sense. The way I find my co-design goes is, so I've got co-designs with you, Peter, obviously, and that's like, we riff really well because we've done so much working with each other, and I find that, it's almost like breathing. Like we don't have to say half of the stuff, we skip
halfway through a sentence.
Yeah, seriously. Or like, you'll be, 2 turns into a playtest and you'll be like, so the issue's the turn. I'm like, yep. And then we're like, cool. We just stop immediately. We don't play. We just like riff on different options for turn order and stuff like that. And, that isn't how all of my co-designers like to do things. And I think it's really important to sort of pick up on how your other co-designers like to do things and figure it that way. And I think too, not just in terms of the strengths of which aspects of the work you want to do, but what types of games you want to work on can be really interesting. For instance, I've got one co-designer, Stefan, and he really likes puzzles and does solo games and micro games, and all that stuff is like pretty far out of my wheelhouse. And so it's interesting having him sort of guiding those sorts of playtests and my different flavor being added to it. Whereas like with Blades that we have with AEG, it's kind of I think a really interesting mix because I come from a tactics game space. I really know that space really well. And you come from a different angle where you don't have all the preconceived, presuppositions of the genre. So starting with Alex, do you guys feel like when you play test when you co-design with other people, do you find that your sensibilities and your tastes end up butting heads or working well with each other?
I think ideally it's the latter, right? If you're butting heads too much, then that might not be someone who you're a good person to collaborate with. I mean, there's 2 main reasons to co-design with someone, right? You like them as a person, or you think that the games you make will benefit from that collaboration. And ideally you have both, but potentially you have someone who you
never both. Never both of those things. It's always one or the other.
Yeah, well, you're just speaking from your personal experience. So.
Yeah. Oh, Alex, by the way, I really like you as a person.
Oh, thanks.
I'm really glad that we established which one of us he likes.
But I've had situations where I have had someone who I was friends with, and we did not necessarily have the same design sensibilities, and those attempts at designing something together tended to be higher stress and fall apart over time, I guess, especially if you're designing remotely. I mean, Peter and I literally fly across the country to each other because we work so much better in person. And then those in-between months when we're trying to do things on TTS and have calls, it's not that we aren't working together well. It's just, maybe 1/10 as efficient as when we're actually in the same room together.
Yeah.
I think that...
I'm going to just bounce off that briefly. I find that when we're together, we ideate really well. And then using that time apart is really good for iterating. So come up with stuff together and then long distance iterate. Then come back and come up with stuff together, long distance iterate. And obviously you can do either in both situations. And we have done both in both situations. But with our big upcoming game with Cardboard Alchemy, big game. It's so big. I just mean literally in terms of table space and hours it takes to play. We ran into a stumbling block with that for months, several months. And I think we even tried once or twice to jump on a call and talk about it. But we said, you know what, this is not urgent. We don't need to have this straight away. Let's wait until we're back together and then fix it. So even though that's that's sort of in the middle of ideating and iterating. I think the space away from it was really good for both of us to be like, what do we like about this game? But then when we got together, I'm sure you remember, 40 minutes? We sat down, we said, let's solve this problem that's been plaguing us for months. 40 minutes later, we had the best version of the game, and in fact, the version of the game that got signed a month later.
Yeah, that's happened on a couple different games that we've worked on.
Yeah.
I think generally, and just to jump back to your original question, AJ, I think when you're ideally, designers should be filling in each other's blind spots, right? So or their weaknesses. So we already talked about in terms of like who's good at physical prototyping versus digital prototyping. Oftentimes, I feel like I have a cheat code going when I'm designing with Mike Mihalsik, because we'll get together, we'll play the game, and he'll go home and just like stay up till 6 a.m. because he's like just insane like that. And then the next day he'll be like, hey, I have the next version. And I'm like, holy crap, that's great.
I blinked,
but then
and
I tend to be the one who sets meetings with publishers and does the pitching or sort of facilitates that, because I have a kind of existing network for that. And I have Mike and I are both kind of on the introverted, don't love pitching games side of the spectrum, which I think a lot of us are. But it's I think
does anyone like pitching games?
I don't know, but I think I have a slightly higher tolerance for it than Mike does, so I tend to do that. And I think we both agree kind of that together we're more than the sum of our parts, then, because of how many more games we've been able to get signed in that relationship than if we were trying to do those things on our own, because we're going way faster, because he's versioning so much faster, and then we're actually getting the things signed and out there. So ideally you're filling in each other's weaknesses. I don't think that means that you can't design with someone when you have overlapping qualities. I think it just means you might still have the same blind spots that you have if you were solo designing. So it's not gonna be worse. It's just gonna be as good or better.
Mm-hmm. One thing in my relationship with both of you, but I just want to throw it to Alex, is that I tend to like much heavier games than either of you. And so when AJ and I work together, I think we tend to work in the lighter space. But Alex, you and I have now made 2 games that are longer than you would ever play. Do you want to speak to that? What's that been like, kind of letting me drag you into the depths of heavy Euros?
It's interesting because it got me out of my comfort zone, right? Like I would say that I have probably played in my life, I don't know, let's say 1,000 hours of heavy games. And let's define heavy games as like 2-hour plus games.
Yeah.
And of those 1,000 hours, I would probably say a good, 800 to 900 of those hours are the games that we designed together. My knowledge of games in that weight class is much, much, much lower than yours and probably the average gamer. I don't tend to like playing those games, but if it's, through the process of design and then with you playing some of those other games that were important touchstones for that process and learning about why people like those games and what systems and interactions are important, if you're, what merits that kind of playtime, right? Because there has to be something compelling to get people to sit down at a table for 2 or more hours to play a game, right? And learning about that from the design side of things has actually really sort of flipped my opinion on those games, because historically I didn't like to play them, and now I don't like to play them, but I am less precious about it, so I will.
You appreciate them in a new way.
I appreciate them, yeah, and I will play them. I just don't tend to like games where 3 hours can go by and I feel like I haven't actually accomplished anything. But
I should have mentioned at the start of the podcast, we have 2 guests today. One is my neighbor's dog, who apparently has a lot of thoughts on collaboration in board games. So if you're hearing that coming through, that is the most excitable that dog has ever been.
When I work with that dog, I do tend to do most of the prototyping. Opposable thumbs, very valuable.
Is that why you fly out here for a month, but I only see you for 2 weeks?
Yeah.
2 weeks with me, 2 weeks with the neighbor's dog.
You should see that dog's BGG page.
To AJ's point earlier, having you work on these big heavy games was also really interesting because you had none of the preconceptions. And similarly, if you like it, then that means that something's working, Like, if you don't play a heavy game and you enjoy this one, then that means... I'm not saying that, the lightest gamers in the world are going to pick up our heavy games, but it does mean that it's not strictly for those people who like 3-hour games.
Yeah, I think that's very fair. Yeah.
Yeah, in the same way as like, AJ and I making a tactics games, and I have no objection to tactics games. They're just not what draws me. So we had to make one that drew me for me to be interested enough to keep on working on it. And similarly, like, we've made a collaborative game or two, probably. Yeah, we've made at least two. And cooperative game, I don't know why I said collaborative. The industry term cooperative, as I call it. We've got a strict like cooperative cozy game that we're working on. And that's not something I would normally play, so we have to make it for me to be interested, which means that I think it really like can do something new in the space.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not dissimilar from like any kind of relationship where if the other person is very into something and you get to experience it through their eyes a little bit, it can help increase your your appreciation.
My girlfriend is so into horses. I've read 2 horse books in the last week, and I now know way more about horses than I ever expected to.
Yeah. I mean, like, people who like, my partner's into horror movies or something, and now I started to like the genre, or, as you're good friends with my wife, Nicole, I just got her into football this past NFL season. So she went from someone who's like, I don't like sports at all to like, so I'll take it.
I really don't like sports.
I still don't like sports, but I'm pretending really well. Yeah.
AJ, what was the original question? I feel like I bounced away from it a little bit.
The question was, I forget exactly how I phrased it, but it was basically about co-design with different people and how your differences can be resolved, and how your different design tastes and sensibilities can work with each other versus not.
Yeah, cool. I think we covered everything I would want to say on that.
Yeah, to build on that, let's talk about resolving disputes in these sorts of relationships. Do you guys have any tips, starting with Alex again, for how to resolve issues if you are butting heads and disagree with a certain direction of the game?
I think this is something that I
disagree.
Oh, okay. There you have it. I just accept Peter disagreeing and then let him have his way.
Yeah, I just get final say all the time. It's great working. It's very healthy.
I was going to say something very nice about Peter, but now I'm not so sure. No, I think Peter and I are very good at this, which is we both strongly feel that at the end of the day, we want the game to A, get published, and B, reach the largest audience possible. So when we make decisions, we are making them from that as a jumping off point of what is the decision that makes this the best game for the most people. And oftentimes in pursuit of that, it's if he says this should be left and I say this should be right, we try it both ways, and whichever one ends up more fun, we go with. And we're both pretty good at being dispassionate about removing ourselves from that equation. So it's very rare that both ideas we have are equally good, and we're not precious about going with the other person's idea if it was the better idea.
I'd go one step further. It's very rare that either of our ideas are any good ever. But no, the rule that Alex and I have always had, and I think AJ and I, we also do this, is just put it on the table. Always, always, always put it on the table. And one of two things will happen. Either A, it'll be really obvious. One is better than the other. And that is 98% of the cases. Like,
agreed.
Unless someone is holding onto an ego, and I wouldn't work with that person. Like, I have just no interest in working
that's
with
your job in the relationship.
Yeah, I have enough ego for both of us. If someone is like, but it needs to be my way. I've worked with developers who are like this. They'll make a change that is a lateral move at best, and then we'll come up with like a better direction or a shift or something like that, and they will just cling on to and it's just the worst. It's just the most infuriating thing when it's no longer about the best move for the game. It's about making sure that their change has impact or whatever. I could not tell you, with very rare exceptions, who came up with what idea in most of our games. Like the Critter Kitchen story is sort of like, I've told it so many times that one I know. And I guess the very start of the project I know, but then past that, there have been times where in a meeting I've been like, man, AJ, this change you made was really good. And he's been like, no, that was your change. Or, it's someone, or vice versa. Like we have that exact same conversation in both directions all the time. Yeah.
Like there are a lot of things that I think were your idea that you say are mine, and vice versa.
And so, put it on the table, put it on the table, put it on the table. The other point of disagreement that you can have is outside of the game. Oh, sorry, no. So I was saying that there's two outcomes. 98% of the time, it's just going to be clear that one's better than the other. The other time, and AJ, I think you and I have run into this probably more than Alex and I have. is there's a disagreement about what game you are making. Do you want to speak on that, AJ?
I think I'll let you give a specific example, and I'll build off that.
So AJ and I are working on a game called Cozy Hollow that I don't know how many times we've talked about now, but it's been it's been on and off for like 2.5 years now, 3 years. It's in a really good spot now, but it was not for a while, so we shelved it for a year and then came back to it. And AJ, I would say more than me, had a really clear vision of what he wanted this game to be. Like really crystal clear. Here is the design goal. Here's the intent. And again, not in a holding on to for ego kind of way, but just like the core of what the game was, he knew to the soul. Like he fundamentally was aware of what he wanted this game to be. And so a few times we ran into scoring issues or this or that. And it was stuff that you couldn't necessarily bring it to the table, or if you could, I was like, yeah, well, cool, that was clearly better. And AJ was like, but it's not because it didn't work, but because it didn't work for the game we're trying to make. The game, the kind of core idea of the game is it is pure positive player interaction in every aspect, in every way. And I would say it probably took me several meetings before I really grokked that, before like I internalized, oh, that is the thing we're trying to make. And then amusingly, we had the fight on the other direction. Where there was a mechanic, do you remember this? There was a mechanic that you wanted to add in. And you were like, but this game's about positive player interaction, so people will never do this mean thing. And I was like, no. You're coming at that backwards. Because the game is about positive player interaction, we can't let them, because I'm telling you, if I play this game, that's what I'm doing every time. Mm-hmm. And rather than say, well, the game's not for you, we were like, oh, right, the goal is positive player interaction. And that is not only like shaping all the decisions we make, but it's shaping what we let the players do. So I'd say that's very rare, but anytime we've had a disagreement about what mechanic to go with, it's come down to what are we trying to do?
And I think it's very useful to have this conversation early in detail. I would say the more time goes on, the more effort I put into that initial meeting and those initial brainstorms and those initial design docs and those sorts of things. And I just make them more and more detailed because I really, if it's me that's sort of like spearheading it, or me that's like proposing the game for someone to co-design with me, I want to like get through all those issues as quickly as possible and make it as clear as possible what I'm trying to do, and vice versa. I ran into this issue where I didn't ask enough questions on a co-design recently, and I was like, oh, you know what? I didn't understand what they were really looking at, and I need to take a step back. And
I didn't do the work,
Yeah. And one other way to help that is if early you're like, I'm not quite getting it, get the other person who does have the clear vision to build out the first prototype so you can see it. We actually did that back and forth on the game we have with AEG twice, where I was like, I see this. And then you're like, I don't make it, so I made it. And you're like, oh, I get it. And then you're like, but I think we should do this differently. I was like, I don't see it. You do it. And then you do it. I was like, oh, I see it. And then I did the first build of the next one. You're like, aha. It was
we really, we sort of came to a nice confluence there.
It's interesting, Peter, what you were saying about how you described the problem of like, okay, well, if you give people this tool, they're going to do this thing. This negative interaction thing that you don't want them to do, because that made me think of this thing where oftentimes whether I'm designing or co-designing, right? Like you have all this institutional knowledge because you've done this before, and you've got these facts floating around your brain of like how people will interact with the systems, how people will interact with the game. One of the great benefits of co-designing is you've got two fonts of institutional knowledge coming in. So a lot of times, even though I would say that you and I are both, perfectly successful game designers in our own right, we don't necessarily know a lesson that the other one has already learned from a past experience or, thing that didn't work or didn't, could work better.
100%.
And that's very valuable. And then that made me think, I have only ever co-designed with people who I would consider of an equivalent design level to me. So like when I was first starting out, I had a co-design with someone who I think we were both like kind of just starting out. More recently, I've worked with you and Mike, and we're further along in our careers. I'm wondering, have either of you ever had an experience where either you were sort of working with someone who you sort of felt outclassed by, or who you felt you had sort of like been around the block a few more times, and then how you sort of resolve and deal with conflicts in those situations of who, like, do you worry about getting steamrolled, or like is there like a deference to experience that you have to like?
I'm going to give a slightly tangential answer, and then I want to hear what AJ's thoughts. I work with Jeff Fraser sometimes. Nowadays, he's sort of stepped out of the design development space, which I think is a real loss because I think he's amazing. And he and I would say, I mean, he's a fairly tempestuous personality, and so am I. We're both very opinionated. That's a better way to put it. And so we would disagree on stuff. We would just really disagree on stuff. And it was sort of what you were talking about with that institutional knowledge. So I'll use the example that I always think of. I don't like arbitrary hand sizes. It's a very specific bugbear. I don't like it when a game's like, you can have a maximum of 7 cards. And I'm like, but why? Don't just give me a number and expect me to accept that. I need to see the paperwork. I need to see the reasoning. And so in our game Cartouche, you can hold a maximum of 4 kind of goals that you're working towards. And Jeff wanted to be like, cool, it's 4, and we'll just trust people to remember that. And that was deeply offensive to my soul. I'm so ridiculous about this kind of stuff. You've probably both encountered this as well. I just don't like it. And so we eventually, the way we solved it was we had 4 slots where they can go. And so you know it's 4 because there's 4 slots. And it is still arbitrary. And Jeff's point was like, cool, you've taken this arbitrary number and written it down. I'm like, yeah, but we're not expecting people to store it in their head. It's not a floating point variable if you know programming. That's what I don't like. I don't like numbers just floating around that you have to remember. My ideal situation is you have 3 because you have 3 huts. And if you build another hut, you'll have 4 hand size and so on and so forth. Or no limit. That's what I think all of our games have always been. In Critter Kitchen, you discard down at the end of the round, but it's printed on the board and it's very clear why it's that number.
Or some sort of counter incentive. Like I think one of you might have pointed this out on this podcast in an episode I listened to, or you told me in person at some point, but like something like even though it's a much older game now, I think it's like a really great design choice in Catan, right? Where it's not a hand limit of 7, but anything you have over that is at risk, right? Yeah. So it's like take as many as you want, but if you've got 20 cards and the thief hits you, bam, right?
So, I love that. Yeah.
It's also something where you don't have to remember the exact number at all times, which is huge.
Yeah, it's only relevant when you're about to get screwed by it. Yeah.
And so I also had a pair of designers, the Stevensons, who I've talked about before, who they have a published design, I think, and they've been doing this for about as long as I have. And we ran into this issue a lot where I would be like, no, like you can't have the numbers be 2, 3, 8, and 9. It has to be 5 and 7. And they're like, but why? And I was like, because those are the numbers that just exist in people's brains. Like we are okay with 5 and 7. We're not okay with 8. It's dumb. And so to a certain extent, I had to sort of appeal to authority. But generally speaking, bring it to the table and that resolves it. AJ, I'd love to hear your answer to this because I think we're in an interesting situation.
Yes, I absolutely have worked with someone who is a better designer than me, and that's Peter.
I wouldn't say better. I've designed more.
I mean, I would say like today we're probably like in the conversation, and I mean it's such an amorphous thing. Like I would never be like tangibly Peter's like 15% better than me today. Or something.
I would say I am indisputably a more published designer than you, and that's a safe statement.
But what I mean is like when I first started designing with you, absolutely you were better than me, absolutely, and at least I think so. Do you not?
I don't like anything I've made more than a year ago. So
fair enough. But I think that we started on a development project for a game. And I think because there was already like a strong baseline to it, that was like a really comfortable way for us to start the relationship working together. And it meant it just like, it's the same thing where if you're a designer and your first design is creating an expansion for a game that already exists, or if you're writing and the first writing that you do is fan fiction where there's already established characters and stuff, it just means that all the hardest stuff is already taken care of. And that was a really fun time too, because it was a lot of us just like picking apart the game and saying like, what like tiny little edges could we improve? What tiny little things could we tweak there? And there was a fair bit of game design involved in that process as well. But that is absolutely the most polarized of relationships I've been in for co-design. I would say at this point, like I've designed with Thomas Desjardins-Lesperance, who did Decrypto. I designed with Stefan Barco. Those are both excellent designers. And I would say like we're in the same ballpark of each other for sure. I would say, I feel nowadays that I'm in the same ballpark as Peter for sure. So I don't feel that big disparity. And I would actually refuse to co-design with somebody who I felt was at a much lower level than me, I would definitely take someone who's higher than me if they wanted to. But, and this might sound like I'm being a dick, but I would playtest any designer's game and give them feedback gladly. That's no problem. But it's the if I feel like I'm significantly above them, and especially if they, I mean, regardless of if they feel it or not, it's actually problematic either way. But it's like, I wouldn't want to feel like I'm being pulled down, or that I'm like having to like do all the work.
It's like the phrase, always try to be the dumbest person in the room. Always surround yourself with people smarter than you. Is that the logic?
Kind of, but it's also like, this is like a little bit selfish, honestly, but it's like, if I feel like someone isn't going to be able to contribute much to the design, like I'm talking like an extreme disparity here. You know, like if someone's like, hey, this is like my first game, do you want to come on as a co-designer? I would just be like, no, definitely, under almost no circumstances.
Well, it's interesting because I think there's like a tangential point here, which is kind of relevant, which is I don't know what other industries are like. And, you know, Peter, you might be able to speak to film or writing, but in board games, I think the default is almost always, and this is just anecdotal, I guess, because I haven't surveyed all the designers, but the default almost always seems to be that if it's a co-design, it's an even split co-design. And the idea of dividing it some other way almost feels like dirty, right? Like, hey, do you want to be my, you know, AJ, in your situation with like someone who's a first-time designer, like you would feel uncomfortable if you said, yes, I'll co-design with you, but it needs to be like a 60-40 split or a 80-20 split, right? Like we're such a like equitable kind of industry that the default is to want to do 50-50. And then because of that, you want to design with someone who you feel is doing 50 to your 50.
Yeah. I've got a few thoughts on that. To directly respond to that, I'll tell two related stories. There's a podcast
about when I was doing a terrible job co-designing with you.
No. Totally, like, genuinely not to do with the industry. My favorite podcast for a long time was a show called Cortex, which is CGP Grey and a guy called Mike, who runs a podcast network, so that's why he's on the podcast. And Mike approached CGP Grey, who is notoriously reclusive and like would not work with people, and was like, hey, I want to do a podcast together. And to sweeten the deal, we'll make it, you get 70%, I get 30%. And Gray said, no, I want to do 50-50. But in exchange for doing 50-50, here's the tasks that I don't want to think about. And in a sense, that's not equitable, but I just love that so much. He was a much bigger name and he was bringing the audience. And so actually, AJ, I think we did that to a certain extent where I was like, I'll do a podcast with you. I'm not doing the editing. And so for a long time, you did all the editing because I was like, I can't just, not that we make any money off this show, but it was a similar kind of thing. And then the other thing, and this is something I've used now with Alex once, and we're about to use it again once the game gets signed. John Brieger is a developer who's been on the show before. He gave me the advice of, if you want to do a split, like if you want to do an uneven split, don't do it on the royalties. Instead, just have one designer get the full advance and then go 50-50 from there.
Yeah, I was going to bring up that example. Are we allowed to talk about the game that we signed yet?
Let's keep it vague. It's a sequel to one of my.
It's a sequel to a game that Peter designed, and we had an idea for what would be a very exciting follow up to that product, and so. In the course of, hey, what feels fair about this? Because it's, this new game is a true co-design, but it's coming from the DNA of something that was just yours. And that's exactly what we did. So Peter got the full advance, and going forward, it's a 50-50 split on royalties after that.
Yeah. And then Alex, actually, I want to bounce back to this later, but Alex basically came to him and was like, hey, here's a game I have fully designed and I don't know what to do with it. Take it. We'll split everything 50-50, but I'll get the advance on that one. And so, like, I'm fairly confident that one's going to be signed because it's amazing. And exact same thing in reverse. The most important thing in terms of splitting royalties, which is apparently what we're talking about now, is what Alex said earlier, which is that you design with someone because you like them. Alex is family to me. Like, Alex's wife, Nicole, is my best friend in the world. Alex is one of my closest friends in the world. His kids are biologically my kids. Sorry to tell you about this on the podcast. You are family more than anyone in this world that is not my actual blood family. And so any disagreement we have, like let's say you got more money than me. Oh no, your kids, who I really do think of as like my kids, not biologically, but like in terms of how much like I care for them, oh no, they're going to have a better future. Oh, better fight this contract. And then AJ and I, we've been friends for what, 8 years now?
Oh, more than that for sure.
Yeah, more than 8 years. And so, you know, when we split a co-design, like, I care about our friendship so much more than I care about niggling over and 4% whatevers. Like, it just doesn't matter to me as much as working with AJ. And so, AJ, you
Guys,
mentioned...
you didn't tell me we're allowed to swear on this podcast. I've been
Did I swear?
holding back. Yeah.
Did he swear? I didn't catch it.
He did. Oh,
I didn't
we're
notice.
not allowed to?
Oh, we have to edit that now.
F-bomb.
I'm so Australian, I don't even notice it, I swear.
I shouldn't have said anything. I could have snuck in.
AJ's so used to it, he doesn't notice either. AJ, you asked about disputes between co-designers, and all the examples so far have been in the game, but I do want to talk about what happens when you disagree outside the game. And obviously my headline is work with people who you like so much that you're not going to disagree with it. I'm going to give a non-board game example, which is I was working with a screenwriter, an aspiring screenwriter like me, and we were working the script together. It was all going great. And then he did something. I'll go into it. I think this is okay to talk about. Basically, he is so staunchly AI, it's like become a part of his personality. He's one of those people who's always like rallying against it. And so at one point...
You said,
what's that?
You said staunchly AI. You mean anti-AI. Knowing your
anti-AI.
politics, I imagine, yeah.
Yes, he's very, very anti-AI, which is fine. Like, we weren't using it in our writing, whatever. There was a rumor, I don't think it was even vaguely confirmed. There was a rumor that Google were going to start pulling data from Google Docs to put into their AI LLM system, whatever. And so he insisted that we stopped using Google for any of our collaboration. And you both know that that's where I live. Like, I live in Google Docs, I live in Google Sheets. I can't work not in that system. That's where all my files are. And so that by itself wouldn't have been enough. But once you've hit that point of ideological difference or ideological inflexibility, negotiating a contract is annoying. It is difficult and annoying, and finding a home is hard enough by itself. If you've got one person with suddenly this really strong ideology, I was looking, 200 meters down the road, 800 feet down the road, I'll translate for you. And just thinking like, I don't want to do that. I just have no interest in, Disney makes an offer and he's like, but we can't work with Disney. Droop, 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 droop. Like, I don't want to do that. So we stopped working together. On the flip side of it, Alex and I, we were talking about this today, actually. We have a big, beautiful game that no one will sign. It's so good. It's so big. It's unsignable for whatever reason. We got an offer on it. And we got an offer from a publisher that we ended up turning down. And the game's still not signed and probably won't be. And so I was saying to Alex today in our chat, like, on one hand, that feels stupid. Like, we ideologically didn't sign a game. But neither, and correct me if I'm wrong, Alex, but neither of us regret that at all.
No, and I mean, it's a very privileged position, right? Because, like, right. We didn't need the money from signing a game. We didn't need the, satisfaction of getting our first game signed, right? We were definitely in the catbird seat of, we can choose to say no to this because it was a bad offer and the publisher was very rude about it. So it was,
yeah. So I guess, opening up to you two, what have you run into any situations where the disagreement is not about what's best for the game, but what's best for the game?
I have been, it's interesting because I don't think they're disagreements in the sense of like they hurt my feelings or caused any kind of actual animosity. But, you and I think, have different sensibilities when it comes to getting things signed. I think you are a contract hawk. Like, you go hard in the paint when it comes time to negotiate the contract. And I have benefited greatly from that. And, the game you just mentioned, I probably would have just said yes to that if I was on my own. And the fact that you didn't just take a bad offer and roll over means the game isn't signed, but it also means, for every one of those, there have been 3 games where we're getting, 2 to 3 to 5 points higher on royalties than we would have if I was the one, just saying yes to whatever the first offer was from the publisher. So
I think I almost gave AJ a heart attack because we got an offer from a very large company. And it was a very standard offer. And I said, nope, we want a higher number. And AJ was like, or we could take the number, or we could sign the game. And I was like, no, I want this higher number. And in fairness, we got the higher number.
Yeah. But, that's but to the earlier thing about like you being a much more signed designer, right? Like if that hadn't gone that way, I imagine AJ would have been, correct me if I'm wrong, AJ, but that would have felt pretty terrible if it's like, oh man, this like great opportunity, we missed out on it because we asked for 2% more and they wouldn't budge, right?
Yeah. I mean, it worked out fantastically. Like we actually got more than we bargained for, and Peter bargained for a lot.
Yeah, they counter offered with a better deal because I made a very compelling case. I was like, look, this is actually really good. Like, if it goes well, we both succeed. And they were like, yeah, okay, you can have a better number than you asked for. We're like, done. Yep.
And to be fair, I'm sure that they would be the first to tell you they couldn't be happier with the relationship post signing the game. Like, we've put in a lot of effort. They've said we're the most engaged designers they've ever worked with post signing. So everyone's happy.
And, I think this is not a comment. It's not exclusively about co-designing, but I think to that point, one thing that is Peter and I have had a lot of success with is repeat business with the same publishers because they do see us put in that effort, right? And getting your second game signed with a publisher, if you're good at what you do and you put in the work on that first game, is so much easier than getting the first game signed because publishers are people just like us and they want to work with people who they trust and like. And I am sure that both, our next game with Cardboard Alchemy and some of the stuff we've got with All Play and all kinds of things, getting that second or third contract was a direct result of being good to work with on the first thing. So that's been nice. And that's, that's a thing to look for in a co-designer, right? Like, do they play nice with other people, right? Like if you and I got a game signed and, you were in there trying to make things work and I came in and just like, crapped all over everything and said, I don't like this. I don't have any solutions, but I hate that. And if you don't change it, I'm not going to put my name on it. That would be, even if I'm not directing that at you, Peter, that would be a perfectly reasonable reason to not want to work with me again.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And that's what my Google Docs example was. Like he's so lovely. I really like, he's going to move to LA soon. I hope we hang out and become friends, but we are friends. I hope we maintain that friendship when he moves to LA. But I could just see like that sort of putting flag in the sand or whatever it is. Like, it's a harbinger of death to describe Alex.
Hey, that's me.
AJ, go ahead.
Yeah, I don't have an example of the meta one, but I do have one that's kind of on the line that I think is a good example of just resolving disputes in general for co-designing. So this is one of the very, very rare cases where you and I couldn't resolve something directly from obvious playtesting. But it wasn't like a binary, one person is wrong, one person isn't wrong. It was just a taste thing. This is the content stuff. So Peter, if you've listened to many episodes of the podcast, know that Peter really loves having lots of content in his games.
Oh, I know what you're talking about. Yeah. I was like, which game are you talking about? Yes, I'm caught up. So I'll interrupt to just say, when we were talking about splitting duties, I always want to be the content guy. I'm even a little selfish about it because it's fun to make the content. And so if they want any, I'll do 10 times as much. And then my co-designers will be like, well, I want to make some too. I just love it. I just love it.
Which is great. It's awesome having, someone who wants to put a bunch of work and make a bunch more content for it. But we were at the point where we were in development and had been in development for like 8 months or something. And I was at the point of being like, all right, I want to trim back a little bit of this content. And at the point where I was thinking that, Peter was like, hey, I just made a whole bunch more content for it. And this is, again, it's not like to say Peter's wrong or I'm wrong. I want to have
purely a taste difference. Yeah.
Yeah. I just want to have the 10 most like polished, my favorite 10 things that like every little interaction has been thought of. And Peter wants to be able to come back to it 100 times and see new stuff. Like totally reasonable point.
New combinations every time. Yeah.
Yeah. And the way that we resolve that is just, I acquiesced to Peter. I was like, listen, we can just have like more content in the game basically. And then at some point in development, we can cut it. At least I said that initially. Once we got into like development, Peter was trying to add more. I was pushing back more on that. But then the development team eventually said, yeah, we want a little bit less content in this. Can you trim it back to just the favorite stuff? And Peter very magnanimously said that, yeah, that's fine. You didn't want to be involved in the kind of the content, but you were like, I see it. I get it. Yeah.
And that's, I mean, it, like you said, it is purely a taste thing, and the publisher's taste trumps our taste, or trumps my taste in that situation. Like, I'm not saying kill your game to make the publisher happy, but in this case, we had two designers who were equally passionate about it, and the publisher said, "We want to do this." So obviously, like, don't piss off the publisher and my co-designer so that I can have my way.
Yeah, and same,
I'll have
like,
my way in other things.
if they had said the other thing, like, man, I wish there was a bit more content, I'd have been like, yep, all right,
Yeah,
let's have more content. So what do you do if a co-designer wants to step away from a project? How do you handle that? Has that ever happened to you, Alex?
So would you say step away in terms of like, I'm done with this and I don't want to come back, or step away like, hey, let's take a break on this because I'm just not feeling it right now, or both?
Let's go with both.
Okay. I know Peter and I at various points in time have felt more or less enthused about particular projects, and we actually, I think, use that to good effect as part of our design process, which is we'll pause something and say, hey, we're butting our heads against a wall here, let's work on our other games. And then oftentimes just the time...
If only we had 11 other games on the go at all times.
Oftentimes just like taking a pause on it means that when we come back, something has been shaken loose and it's there for the picking. So that to me has never been a problem. I have had situations where either I or my co-designer sort of was just not feeling that there was a reasonable way to continue working on a game. I had a co-design that I started about 5 years ago, 5.5 years ago, right when I moved to North Carolina with one of the guys in my local group. Lovely guy, had a few published games. This is not like a negative story, but I will not, I guess, say who it is because it's not relevant to it. But we started working on a game together. COVID happened, right? So it was then needed to immediately be like a remote kind of design process, which I'm not a huge fan of. I'm not great at when it's all remote, especially because the game in question was a very like three-dimensional physical kind of game, and just trying to do that on TTS and just, I was not feeling it. And then I had my first child had just been born, and I was just burnt out, and I was not in a headspace to keep doing it. And so I was like, hey, look, I cannot match your excitement level and your time commitment to this. I am happy to, just here's a formal email saying like, this is fully yours if you want to continue with it. Because, he was very excited about it. He wanted to keep going with the idea. And so I was just like, totally fine. Here's the thing saying that like, it's now fully yours, right? I'll pay you $1 or whatever or something, or you pay me $1 to like buy me out of it or something, just legalese or whatever. That was it. And that, and I felt a little bit bad, but I felt better than I did when we were working on it together. And I didn't feel like I was holding up my end of the bargain, right? Because like you said, you want that 50-50, or like we were talking about earlier, you want that 50-50 kind of feeling. And I knew that I wasn't giving 50%. I wasn't even giving like 25%. And it just didn't make sense at that time for me. So I was fine with that interaction. And then, that guy, I remember feeling like a little bit guilty about it at the time because, he was like kind of didn't feel great about it. But then later, like a year later, he had a kid himself, and he came back to me like a few months later. And he was like, oh, I totally get it now.
You haven't slept in 3 years. Yeah, I understand now. They tell you about the lack of sleep, but God, you don't understand until you've done it. Just how little sleep you get.
Yeah. So like trying to like, have a design call, once a week at like 10 p.m. or something right after you get your kid down was not what I wanted to be doing with my life. So it hasn't happened to me a ton, but the times it has, it's been pretty easily resolved as long as both parties are reasonable, I would say. What about you, Peter?
So when they were making Arrested Development, they had a rule in the writers' Do you want to explain why that's funny, Alex?
Welcome to the podcast.
Peter has told me a story that starts with that sentence 40 times. And the first, I would say 25 of them, he didn't remember that he had told me before. So
again and again and
I heard
again
it for
and
the
again.
first time 25 times. And now it's just a range.
When they were making Arrested Development, they wanted to have so many great jokes in the script that they had to cut great jokes. I love that philosophy. When we were making Critter Kitchen, that was... We made... There's 18 carts in the game. We made, 40?
At least.
There's 37 zoo chefs. We made 100. Like, we way over-delivered so that when they were cutting, it wasn't like, well, obviously these ones. It was like, God, we love all of these and have to cut them. And this is why, as AJ said earlier, I don't like being part of the cutting process. That's not the fun part to me. But making the stuff, I love.
I'm going to give everyone a quick little tip here because maybe this will get cut. Who knows? But this quick, random, stupid tip is sometimes, I don't know if this happens to you, Alex, but you'll get into sort of a riff and you'll be like, all right, we found a problem. And you'll be like, well, you could increase hand size, or you could decrease the cost of this, or you could do this. And you sort of end up in this situation where you keep bouncing ideas off over and over, but they don't quite fit. And what I found works a lot, what Peter and I do all the time, is when we get into those loops, we'll just stop and we'll be like, okay, let's just say out loud what the problem is. And just doing that, just like very clearly articulating the problem, making sure we're on the same page, and then thinking through, okay, are any of these solutions actually addressing that problem? And are any of the solutions addressing the problem in a way that, undermines the core of the game, or are they actually something that's going to reinforce the core identity of the game? Like we said with Cozy Hollow, everything has to be positive player interaction. So our solutions have to solve whatever specific problem we have right now, and they have to be able to actually address them in a way that still supports the positive player interaction. Do you have any experience with that?
I think that's great advice, because I think, like any relationship, you want to make sure that you're both talking about the same issue at the same time, right? Like, like with your partner or something, it's, if we're having an argument, are we arguing about the same thing? Are we on the same page about what we're even discussing, right? And having those check-ins is great, because I think, with Peter and with other people I've co-designed with, just verbalizing the problem, like you just said, sometimes you'll realize that you're both trying to solve different problems, and that's why you aren't seeing eye to eye.
Hey guys, I'm back. My internet is letting me join the call again. So what I was saying is that basically it's a concept called scarcity mode that I think about all the time, and I'm sure I've mentioned on the podcast. If you have a lot of a thing, you're not going to be precious about it. And so that's exactly how I am with co-designs. My favorite method is the person who wants to leave the co-design just wholeheartedly gives it to the other person. And that's what Alex did in his example, and AJ, you and I have had that on at least one game where I was like, look, I'm not excited about this, and I need to be excited on a game like very, very, very early on to work on it. So I was like, it's yours. Like everything we've done, every part of the idea. And I think that was an idea that I brought, like thematically, and I was like, nope, it's yours. Like take it, do what you will with it. So that is very much my attitude towards the thing from 45 minutes ago when I left the call.
Yep, I think that's the best way to do it. It's clean. It feels fair to the other person. It respects that the game isn't done, that it shouldn't be like a royalty split, because it's still in a rough enough spot that obviously you walked away from it before it was done. If it was really that close to done, you probably wouldn't have walked away, right?
Yeah, I have seen other people be in situations where they tried to math their exit out in a way that led to hard feelings later, right? We're like, I don't want to work on this anymore, so let's make it, like a 30-70 split. And it does not work. If you're going to walk away. Don't try and like bake it into some kind of contract.
Well, yeah. And like Peter said earlier, like presumably you're co-designing with your friends. What do you care about more? Maybe gain a few dollars down the line if the thing even gets published, or do you care more about maintaining a healthy relationship with your friend?
Yeah. 100%.
That's why you should always co-design with your enemies, because then you can be ruthless in the negotiations.
This is just a simple thing. Can we just talk benefits and disadvantages of co-designing? Alex, just right off the top of your head, what are the benefits of co-designing versus doing it solo?
I think efficiency is a huge one. Ideally, in a co-design relationship, you are more than twice as productive, right? It's not just twice as productive; it's significantly more, because you're kind of getting. This isn't exactly the right language, I guess, but you're getting free play testing as you go, kind of, because there's two of you, right?
100%. So, that was going to be my first point.
Right. Like it's just the nature, unless it's a game that has a minimum player count of 3 and you, for whatever reason, can't fudge that in the testing process because it's like a social deduction game or something. The act of just designing the game with someone else means you are pushing pieces around on a board and trying things out, and you can get to those answers so much faster. I think all of us who've done solo design know that experience of like working through in your head how you think something's going to go and building out all the pieces and then taking it to your design group very excitedly, only to find out within like one turn that it did not work at all like you expected. And now you have to wait another week to get more information with your next version. So you completely skip that line.
The bandwidth is so much larger.
Yes. So that's a huge advantage. I would say what you were talking about earlier about if one of you has a type of task you're not a fan of, if the other person is able to fill that gap, then that can be great. So, when I designed with Mike Mihalsik, him being able to go iterate the next physical version of the prototype is such a load off my plate. Like, I appreciate that so greatly, because if I was trying to just build out versions by myself, I would be significantly slower, and I would probably, half the games we've made together, I probably would have just like shelved and been like, I don't want to make a whole new version of this. So that's huge.
Disadvantages.
Do you have no advantages to add to that?
I don't think there are any.
I was so perfect in my analysis that he has nothing to add.
I thought we were doing one by one. So aside from the stuff that Alex mentioned, which is very, very true, one thing that I've found just so good, if I'm solo designing and I get stuck on a problem, that can either be the end of the design or that can be the end of the design for months or years. In a co-design, almost every time I'm stuck in a problem, sort of what you were saying earlier, I can just vocalize the problem and the other person will be like, oh, well, now that you've vocalized it, here's a solution. I'm like, of course that's the solution. Yes. And so it just gets rid of those speed bumps, which for me can completely derail, to mix metaphors, a project forever. I mentioned earlier that I co-designed with Jeff. We actually, I'm realizing now, co-design differently than I've ever done before, which is because we both were so opinionated and often in opposite directions. We would just be like, okay, cool, you build the next draft and play test it, and then come back and we'll play it together. And all the stuff I disagree with, I will just take out and I will play test a draft. And it was funny because a lot of the times I would take something out that I was like, that's stupid, I don't like it, play tested it. I'd be like, oh, you know what would fix this problem? That exact thing I just took out. So just having two different brains on it, like I think both of you would agree, I think very differently to either of you, and you two probably think very differently from each other. And so many times where I'm like, well, this is obviously an unsolvable problem. One of you will be like, oh, or we could just do this thing that solves it. We just immediately fix it.
Yeah.
It's so funny how often one of the two of us will have a problem and be like, oh yeah, how do we solve it? And the other person's like, it's just so obvious, you do that. It's like, oh, I guess that's not a problem.
So yeah, the two different brains, again, to Alex's point, like it's more than twice as good as working by yourself, not only for speed, but just for the angles that you can take from it.
Yeah, and this made me think of it while you were talking. We haven't talked about this, and I don't know that we need to go into crazy depth on it, but we've been talking during the course of this podcast and video pretty much exclusively about two-person co-designs. We haven't really broached the topic of like if you have
two. I don't think.
Well, so I was just going to say I have done it once before. It's not super common, but I'd imagine that you'd get into the cons camp a little bit of it's not you're not able to just have two people kind of pick the best of the two choices. You end up in that sort of like that triangle power dynamic thing of two people think that the right way is one thing and steamroll the third person. Like even if you're not trying to,
two people is relationship, three people is politics.
Right. Yeah. So I don't have a lot of experience with that. But yeah. So this advice may not be applicable if you're trying to co-design with your polycule.
It would be interesting to get like Flat Out Games or the Sprawlopolis guys on, because like those are two people or two groups of people who design a lot in a trio. Another huge advantage, and this is a very specific one. So I'll use Critter Kitchen as an example. Critter Kitchen, I think, is best at 3. I think 3 is like the best player count for that. I think it's great at all player counts, but it's best at 3. And a best at 3 game is often not that good at 2. But because the vast majority of playtesting for Critter Kitchen was me and Alex playing against each other, the 2-player mode is amazing. Like it's like for a game, I've had a lot of people be like, oh, well, this game, people will play it 4 or 5 and be like, yeah, I guess it has like a dummy hand at 2 or whatever. It just doesn't. We just because we needed to solve those problems before we could playtest. Like every time we sat down to playtest, if we ran into a 2-player problem, we couldn't playtest without solving it. So that game had so many built-in like scaffolding for an amazing 2-player experience. So yeah, the benefit of in a duo specifically designing is that you end up a lot of the time with a really great 2-player mode.
Yeah, for sure.
I think just building on the like sounding board comments is one thing I get a lot of co-designs is more confidence in those early playtests and stuff. just having someone to like bounce ideas off of, and me being like, oh, I think this is a cool idea for something, and then immediately having feedback of that is a cool idea, or no, that doesn't work because of this.
Right.
It gives you a lot more confidence, and it saves you a lot of like early iteration cycles and that kind of thing.
I think the thing that I bring to co-designing, less so with Alex, but with most of the other people I co-design with, is I'm very good at not letting us go down the wrong track. And I say not with Alex because he's even better at it than I am. But one of my co-designers, AJ or Matt or Tom Lang or Jeff or someone like, will suggest an idea that I just, again, from like a decade of doing this, I'm like, that's a trap. Like, I'll use a really obvious example, putting in any kind of exception. And AJ, you're pretty good at cutting these exceptions, but I think one thing I do is I really cut it off at the stem. Like, as the co-designer is reaching out to plant a seed, I'll pull out my gun and shoot it out of their hand.
That's quite a mixed metaphor.
But I think you guys have missed the most important benefit of co-designing.
Splitting the royalty.
You only get half the money.
Can you see why we work together?
That's what the disadvantages column. I was going to say it's so fun, but I guess you guys have more fun arguing over percentages.
Yeah, well, getting half the royalty is a fun problem. So.
No, it is just fun to like creatively work with the people you love. It absolutely is. I love it.
I mean, Peter and I were friends before we started co-designing together, but it's absolutely made our relationship stronger. I mean, it gives us an excuse to spend time together. And like
you would not be flying out to LA twice a year for a week
right.
if we weren't co-designing. You just wouldn't, like, it wouldn't make any sense.
Yeah.
And I think, like, for me personally, like, my co-designs have mostly come from people that I play test with a lot, and then we just click so well and like get on the same page, have such similar sensibilities, have this cool idea. It just sort of emerges out of those people that I already like spending time with a lot, Yeah. So, yeah.
Right, disadvantages.
Yeah, let's start with Alex. What's the biggest disadvantage besides Peter being Peter?
Yeah, the disadvantage is having to spend time with Peter so much more than he would otherwise.
Right. So we just mentioned, right, you're splitting the royalty. I don't really consider that a disadvantage because if the co-design is doing what it should be doing, you're signing a game twice as faster than you would be otherwise. Maybe if you only have one game and it happens to become an evergreen and that's all you ever do, it feels like a disadvantage. But I think when you're doing this over and over again, it's like a career. It's not a problem because
they come out, you make them faster, and in our cases, me with both of you, they soar higher than the solo designs. Like,
absolutely,
they're more than twice as good. Go ahead, Alex.
Yeah. I will say I can speak to something that is probably like more unique to me than I think either of you in terms of a potential disadvantage. Without going like too deep into the details, I had a co-designer who I worked with in the past who I had a personal falling out with, and so we're no longer friends. And we had some games together that maybe they are signed with a publisher who wants a sequel, or the rights have now reverted, and we could be in a position to pitch them again somewhere else or something like that. Any of that follow-up kind of stuff is now infinitely more complicated because we don't want to have a business relationship anymore because we don't have a personal relationship anymore. So, if the publisher isn't paying us royalties properly or something, we can't present a united front to handle that. So.
Oh, that reminds me. One of the, just while we're talking about co-designing, one lovely thing about working with Alex and AJ both actually is that when you're negotiating with a publisher, and I don't mean the contract, I mean like post signing when you're in the development process, it's really good to have someone to bounce thoughts off. Like, they did this, and I don't know how to feel about that, and you just get a thought back, and then you can alternate who drafts messages, and like it's really important to provide that united front. I think that's so vital. Peter Vaughan from Cardboard Alchemy has said that he thought he would never work with a co-designer because it's twice as much work. And then between working with us and working with Luke and Max Laurie, who made Andromeda's Edge, he's like, oh, it's great because we provide such a united front. It's not like dealing with two personalities. It's like dealing with no personality.
Well, I've been on the other side of that as a publisher. So when I was working at Pandasaurus, some of our designs that we signed were co-designs, right? And it is so much nicer when both designers are on the same page. Like it's a complete 180 from like, there was one pair of designers that was difficult to work with, and it was more one of them than the other, and that really actually caused problems for like wanting to work with one or both of them again. Whereas the partnerships where we worked with and they were both great, it made us more likely to want to work with them as a pair or them as individuals, right? So
Alex is better at diplomacy than I am, so I in the same way as I deal with the contract negotiations, I'm like, Alex, it's a diplomacy problem, fix it, and he does. It's great.
Yeah.
The two big disadvantages, I don't like the word disadvantage, I'm going to say the cost. In the same way as like when you get married, the cost is that you now have to factor this person into all your plans. For me, I work very, 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 very fast. I iterate really quickly. And so sometimes with collaborations, it can be like, I'm ready for the next draft, but I don't want to I don't want to get 3 drafts ahead. I've had that happen before. I worked with a designer, quite a big name designer, and I would playtest and then email him the notes, and he'd reply with like a thumbs up. So I'd playtest again and email him the notes, and by the end I just felt like I was designing this game, and he just couldn't keep up with me. And that's not a diss. He was a very, very, very busy man, but I just want to go. Like I will, when I'm solo designing, or when I'm in the same space as someone else, it's more likely to happen. But especially when I'm solo designing, I will design for 10 hours straight on the same game. I will just build it, play it against myself, rebuild it, play it against myself, rebuild it, play it against myself. And, co-designers are busy and they burn out faster than everyone burns out faster than I do. That's not an insult. I can just go and go and go. So I do sometimes feel a little bit slowed down by co-designing. It's not a disadvantage, it's a cost. Like the cost of the game being twice as good and coming together faster than it would if I was solo designing is that you are working to someone else's schedule.
Yeah, and I think that's a cost regardless of which person you are in the relationship, because I'm on the other side of this to Peter, right? And there have absolutely been weeks where just between like kid stuff and home stuff and other work stuff, I just was like, I'm not available. I'm not putting in work. I'm not working on this thing that Peter's very excited to work on, right?
Yeah.
And I feel guilty, or I feel like I'm not carrying my weight. Or, he says, hey, don't worry about it, I got it. And he goes off and does a version. I'm like, well, but I wanted to like be involved in the version, right?
I wanted to design the game.
I wanted to make content. But
nope.
We're very good at smoothing that over and not having it be a problem. But that comes from a place of having the experience of dealing with it and knowing how to navigate it and being very good friends outside of game design. So, and that is what, that example I gave earlier of the game that I had to, back out on, that I was working on with one of my local designers. Like it was that exact same thing, except we didn't have that history. We didn't have that working relationship to where it made sense to try and navigate it and keep it alive. Right. So the correct answer was to just give it back. But, oftentimes, I mean, Peter has so many projects that he's working on that if I'm not available to work on one of our things, it's not like he's just sitting there twiddling his thumbs.
Yeah,
right?
I'll go design 8 other games while I wait.
Yeah.
And then the other one is sort of related, which is when you have... So I'll use Critter Kitchen as an example. We made Critter Kitchen together. That is a pure co-design. Like it could not exist without either of us. And I would like to, on some level, take that core mechanism and try some other stuff. And that doesn't feel right to me. Because Alex and I, we have, like I said, literally 11 games that we just don't have time to get to. And so I don't want to be like, hey, remember that game that we made together? I've made my own version. Bye. Like, I can't do that. I don't want to do that. And so there is a slight limiting factor of like, if it's a collaborative idea, it doesn't belong to you. It belongs to you as a pair.
Yeah, that's a great point, because I have a solo design that I don't know. I don't think I've played it with you, AJ, but Peter, I have a mechanic that I don't know if it's 100% novel, but I called it like pick or push. It's like a type of drafting that I had not seen in other games.
Yeah.
And it leads to a lot of really fun moments. And I designed a game with that. I got it signed. It came back during the COVID years, but then it got signed again. And then I used that same mechanic to design another game that got signed. And then I used that same mechanic to design another game that got signed. And because it's my own idea, I'm not ripping anybody off by doing that. So I don't have to stop and check in with someone or be like, hey, is this too close to that thing we made together? Yeah. Which, if you did the Critter Kitchen system in a later game, I'd be like, I would feel a little bit bad about that.
Because I would feel bad doing it. Like it's not an option.
It's funny too, because like you would have, it's not the politest way to phrase it, but like game designers rip off games all the time. Like you can't make a mechanic that is truly novel. For like if you have sushi go drafting in your game, you're presumably like you saw it and played it and now you're using it.
Yeah.
But because you don't you're not friends with Phil Walker Harding, you don't feel like you're doing anything untoward.
Yeah. My game Fiction is based on the web app Fibble. And
Right.
I was like, well, cool, it's out there now, I can do that. Whereas if you had made Fibble, it would be a wildly different situation.
Yeah. So you're less able to reuse your good ideas for other designs when they're coming from a co-design, or at least you feel ickier if you do. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
AJ, what you got?
I think that's a good spot to stop it. But would you like to introduce our new segment?
Yes. Actually, no, sorry. I wrote down some stuff that I wanted to quickly cover.
Oh, sure. Please.
Just because we are aiming to be the most practical podcast, I just want to ask some really practical questions. How do you find a co-designer? We didn't cover that. Well, we sort of incidentally did, but I wanted to really give concrete advice. Hey, Alex, you go first.
You marry their best friend.
Nicole's been my best friend for 8 years now.
That's how I met Mike too, so it's great. Yeah.
When Nicole met Alex, she was like, "He's a game designer. You two can design together." And I was like, sure thing, Nicole. That's gonna happen because it's so rare to find someone you collaborate with." And then she was right.
Well, she has good taste.
In best friends, agreed.
Yeah. For me, most of my co-design relationships have come about from people in my local design groups. Peter was the exception. Peter, I did not meet locally, right? He was someone who I met on the convention circuit through my wife. But pretty much everyone else I've ever designed with, it's a local designer who I'm playing their games, they're playing my games. We get a good sense of if we are working well together. And then we, organically or by design say, hey, let's think of an idea to work on together. Or, hey, that thing you brought to, group today made me come up with this good idea, but because like what we were just saying, like because it's similar to yours, I wouldn't want to do it if you weren't involved. So would you like to work on it together? And I've seen so many, co-design partnerships come out of the group that I'm a part of, right? Like other people who are like just pairing off and pairing off.
I really think Raleigh has the best design group in America. Like, and I'm not saying that because you're there. Despite
it really does.
Yeah.
It's certainly the best per capita. In terms of density of published game designers, it's absolutely the highest. But we have a group that meets 5 times a month. Game Designers of North Carolina, shout out. 5 times a month, and routinely has between 6 and a dozen people coming out to each meeting, and has 80 to 100 active members. Yeah. And as
it's a really cool group.
We have, I think, we're pushing 200 published games. So. Very strong representing North Carolina, which is, as you know, directly north of California. So,
AJ, your answer is going to be almost the complete opposite of Alex's.
Is it?
I'm thinking about the people you design with. Are they local people you met through local playtesting?
Not through local playtesting, but through. Actually, yeah, my answer is really weird. My initial thought was, it's just people that I playtested with, but it's actually a lot more complicated than that. If I trace it back one step further, I met through local playtesting at ProTO the first year, which everybody knows, of course.
But we didn't start designing together until this podcast. So just start a podcast with them is the obvious advice.
Yeah. So, start podcast with someone. That's a great way of doing it. Thomas I met at a different ProTO very briefly. I playtested his game, didn't know who he was, criticized him on how he taught his game, then taught his game to other people to try and make it a smoother process.
If you've played Decrypto, that's not a surprise. That game is the hardest game to teach in the world. It's worth it, but it's so hard to teach.
Apparently, that made a good impression on him, so we became friends, and then we playtested every week for a year or two, and then started co-designing just last year. And then Stefan was someone that I met through this podcast as well, who was a listener.
I didn't realize that.
Yeah, I don't remember how we initially met, but it was something. It was either in the Discord I was asking for playtesters or something like that. I'm pretty sure. Stefan might remember, but it was something to do with the podcast is how I met him. I'm pretty sure. And then similar thing. We playtested a whole bunch, and eventually, with him, he told me about an idea he had. Or it was a fully built game, not an idea. But he was like, it's not quite working. But I was like, that sounds so cool. Let me see it. Yeah. And then immediately I was like, well, if you redid this part and redid this part and redid this part, then it would be great.
You forced your way into a co-design.
Basically. And now we're working on 2 different games where it was like one of them was his initial idea, one was my initial idea, and we're both alternating what we're doing. So it's working great.
I think the general advice answer is the same as mine, which is playtest with people, playtest with people, playtest with people. My local co-designer Matt is interesting because we were playtesting just the two of us for about a year before we started co-designing, and part of the appeal was sort of what we were talking about earlier. Is I was just like, you think about games so differently to me. So in a sense, like I'm a more published designer than him. He's got a few games out now, but like I've got far more out than him just because I have a stupid number of games out. But I never thought of it as looking like down on him or anything like that, because I was just like, I want to learn how you think about games because I like your designs and they're nothing like I would make. And then sort of the what not to do would be, I can't swear because we don't swear on this podcast, but in LA there's a term called star effing, which is when if someone's a little bit famous, you want them. And I would advise against doing that. Like never, ever, ever like get stars in your eyes. There is a pretty well-known designer who I think everyone in this podcast has had him be like, we should co-design. And the first response is like, yeah, you're a huge deal. And then you realize a few months in, oh, he's not actually co-designing. He's just taking my design and putting his name on it. So do not co-design with someone because they're a big deal. Strongly recommend it. And certainly don't approach someone and be like, hey, you're famous, let's co-design, because it's star effing. It's not good. Okay, the next really practical one I have is how do you start a co-design? AJ, you already talked about, hey, that game you made, I want to do this with it. Or Alex, I think you mentioned that as well. But what are some other, like, Alex, you and I got together and were like, let's co-design. What was the next step?
So you and I think this, I don't know if this has been mentioned on the podcast before. You and I have our hot tub time, right? Where we we get in a hot tub and we just talk about games, and it leads to some like really cool designs. But I don't know, I'm thinking back to like Providence, the big heavy game that no one wants to sign that you mentioned earlier, and that came about because
so unsignable.
7 years ago, just before I moved to North Carolina, you came to me and you were like, hey, I like time travel, and you have a city building game, and we should make a game about time travel and city building. And it was just like, here's this thing I like. Here's chocolate. You have peanut butter. Like, let's just, And I think that's a perfectly fine way to do it, right? Like, if you're designing with someone, hopefully you respect them and the things that they've done. So the idea is, what is something that I think you're really good at, or you're really good at seeing, either thematically or mechanically, and then how can I bring something to the table that meshes well with that, and where's that sort of magic spark when those two meet in the middle. And so for our origin story and for a lot of the games we've made together, I think they've definitely just come out of a place of us talking about something maybe completely unrelated to game design even, and then being like, oh, there's a game there, there's something. Or like, we came up with a game 2 trips ago in LA, a drawing party game where literally Peter was talking about a game that he had played, and the you talked to a publisher who was like, I really wish there was a game that did this. And then within like 5 minutes in the car of talking about it, we were like, we just came up with a game that does this. Like,
actually, this is a really good example of another huge advantage of co-designing, which is when you misinterpret what the other person said and come up with a better idea. So, like, countless times, one of you will say something and we're like, oh, like this? And like, no, but that is better than what I was saying. Let's do that. Adjacent to that is my famous line. If you've co-designed with me, you've heard me say this 1,000 times. Okay, I've got a bad idea. And just like throwing out a bad idea opens the door to a million good ideas in a way that sitting in silence doesn't. And a shocking number of times the other person will be like, that's not a bad idea, and here's why. And I'm like, oh, that's not a bad idea.
I mean, that's a super invaluable skill, right? It's like a conversation starter almost, where it's like you are very, very good at like, here's this little like idea seedling that I'm just going to throw out there, and then like, how can we react to it? And you're very good at like thought-provoking questions, right? So
I plant the seed and you don't shoot it out of my hand, you see?
And if you don't have a fully formed idea, sometimes, I'll just be like, listen, I don't have a full thing, but what if in this direction, this kind of effect worked with this kind of, it's just like very amorphous, but it gets you thinking in the right direction, right?
100%. AJ, how do you start co-designs?
So this is, if I'm interpreting your question correctly, we have decided we want to make a game together.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, cool. So the way that I start is I have a big, long list of game ideas that I haven't started working on, and I read out all of them. And then I say, what ideas do you have?
Yeah.
and we find the one that we are both excited on. Step one.
Yes. Yeah.
Step two.
Sorry, that was going to be my answer, so I want to jump in. Like, it's about tickling the other person's brain. So AJ, literally, we've done this. He will read out 5 ideas. I'm like, I don't care about 4 of those, but that last one, that has got me thinking. What if we did this? And then you're off. You're racing. Like you're going. Go ahead, AJ.
Mm-hmm. So then, once you have agreed on one of the game ideas, oftentimes you'll like riff a little bit on the spot. And then what I usually do is, if it was one of my ideas, I will write out like a really, really simple design doc. I've got one right here. I'm just going to read out one of the games I'm working on with Stefan. I think he'd be fine with it.
He'll be fine.
So this is AI on a long distance ship, similar to, was it Gen 7 or whatever that one was called? Like that.
Wall-E.
It's the one that does the Crossroads thing, where it's like a generation ship that's like.
Yeah.
So anyway, it's along those lines where it's like the last remnants of humanity is like leaving Earth, and it's about that journey. So the ship starts off perfect, and it falls apart as you go, and you're like triaging all these broken systems and stuff. So immediately we were like, okay, so what's the player count? What publishers would be interested in it?
Yes.
What are the different types of hooks? Trying to get hit all the notes. What type of gameplay should it feel like? What mechanics are we considering to start with? What does a round look like? What are your objectives? Stuff like that. So then I write all this out, and then I present it to my co-designer, and I say, hey, and I basically just pitch it to them. I'm like, what if we did this? And like anytime they want to, we just stop and we flesh out a thing where they're like, I don't think that really makes sense here. What if we did this instead? And we just work through it. Once we're done going through the whole note, now we've got a good idea of what the game looks like. And then again, if it's my idea, I will usually build out the first draft, and we'll I'll throw it together very, very roughly. We'll play it, and it'll fall apart in 5 minutes, and we'll discuss, and then we're off to the races.
The designing to a publisher thing, as you know, that's something I think about all the time. And so Alex and I have had many. Either we'll start with like, what game would we design for this publisher, or after we've got an idea that we like, the first thing we do is like, okay, which publisher is this for? And I think we've done that all the way back to Providence.
Yeah, we have a whole spread, in the same way, AJ, that you were describing, track, like building out that information of like what hooks, what player counts, what things you want in your game. Peter and I have a similar kind of like Google Sheets structure of like, here's all of our in-progress designs, here's who they'd be a fit for, here's like A-tier publisher targets, B-tier publisher targets, who's rejected it, who's looking at it, things like that.
The other way to start a co-design, which is... we touched on earlier in the podcast, is literally Alex. I'll use the most recent one between us, which is Alex. Yeah, sat down, said, "Hey, I have this game. I don't know what to do with it." We played it. I took it away. I rebuilt it. I came back. We played it. We rebuilt it. Like just one person having a complete design or a design they're stuck on, and just being like, "Here, go."
Yep. That's actually, I was going to bring that up when it got back around to me, which is that is exactly how Mike and I do pretty much all of our designing. Very few of our designs started from the ground up, being a new thing in between both of us. We've basically taken turns bringing one of our old games that we consider sort of shelved or dead, that we're like, this was a really cool concept. I like 50% of what it was doing or 80% of what it was doing. I never got it to work. Let's make this our next game. And from that like sort of scrap heap revival, we've gotten 3 contracts already of like, we just alternate like, hey, next one up is from your list, right? So we have a game coming out from Smirk and Dagger that's going to Kickstarter, I think, this month. January 2025. I don't know when the podcast is coming out. Called
in 4 years' time.
Yeah, never. It's called A Place for All My Books, and it's like a cozy kind of book stacking game where you're moving books around your apartment. And it's based off of a design of mine called it was called Sandoku. It was like a book stacking game. It was like a Japanese word that means like buying a bunch of books and stacking them up around your apartment and never reading them, which I came up with like 7 or 8 years ago. And I thought it was such like a cute, clever idea. But the direction I was going with it was much more of like, if you ever played like Rush Hour from Ravensburg, it was like a push puzzle kind of thing where like you put a book into one thing and it moves, and it was much more of like how can you solve this puzzle? I had like a little book of puzzles, and Ravensburger evaluated it and didn't want it, and there weren't a lot of other publishers out there who want that type of game, and so it was just on a it was on a shelf, and that was
ironically
something that Yeah, exactly. And I thought it was just such a cool concept. So when Mike and I started working together, I pulled it out, and like, pretty much immediately it became a completely different game. Like that's not at all like the core like genesis of the idea is still the same, but like in terms of the actual mechanics of the game, it's completely different now. And it's much more of like a true co-design. But that came from this, old idea that I had that Mike thought was interesting enough to want to iterate on, and then we've done that with some of his ideas as well. And it's kind of like a great. I think it's actually a really good thing to highlight that as much as I love co-design and as much as I think co-design is great, I don't think you should only do co-design.
Oh, yeah. I'm glad you mentioned that.
I
it is a red flag for me when I see someone who only co-designs.
Right. It's for all like the strengths of it, for all of the ways it accelerates the process. If you haven't cut your teeth on like designing your own game by yourself and going through those steps, I think you don't have a lot of that institutional knowledge and sort of background that would make you a good co-designer.
Yeah, it's like when you meet someone who has never not been dating. It's like, do you not like yourself? And I guess there would be an exception for like people who only design in the same pair all the time. For me, the red flag is when I see someone who has 20 listed co-designers and no designs of their own. I'm just like, what's happening there? I don't know. Maybe that's a crazy opinion. When Alex comes to stay, I realize that we're way past your bedtime. When Alex comes to stay for a week, we work so intensely because he's away from the kids and I cancel my meetings and we just like work. So many of our designs come from one of us just being like, hey, is there anything in this? What if, every third time you flip a coin, you get another coin? Whatever. Like, that's a terrible example, but something like that. So often the other one of us will just be like, yes, and it could look like this. And again, after the race, it's sort of like AJ's list of games reading out and tickling the brain, but just like literally as we're walking to a cafe, we will do that. We've had multiple games come from a walk to a local cafe.
You and I have designed games on long walks, on long car rides,
in the hot tub.
In the hot tub for sure. Over just Facebook Messenger, chatting about unrelated things. Like having uninterrupted time to just be in the same space with the other person without even the intention of designing a game has led to some really great ideas. Yeah.
Okay, AJ, do you want to lead back into me? I'm leading into you, leading back into me.
Peter, do you want to introduce the new segment?
I wasn't expecting this. Oh my goodness. I'm all aflustered.
For a second, I forgot what you were asking me to do.
So we have a very lovely Discord. Please come join our Discord. It's such a lovely little community. I really love it. And people started asking for topic ideas, which we fully welcome, by the way. Please jump in the Discord, suggest topics that you'd like us to talk about. We love that. One person requested sort of how to be product first, how to think more about publishability, which I feel like I talk about too much already. I feel like that's more of a focus of the podcast than I want to. But I completely see how that's valuable information. So rather than try to do an episode about that, where we'll miss a bunch of stuff, I want to start doing one tip at the end of every episode. So we need a catchy name for this, but it's basically how to make more producty, publishable games. And because we have a special guest today, Alex, can you start off our new section with a tip about how to get games published? Because you are incredibly prolific. You've got dozens at this point.
Yeah. I think. I mean, there's a lot of stuff on BGG that doesn't count as a game, but between what I have published and what is coming out, I'd say I'm somewhere in the 15 to 25 range, depending on how you count it.
That's great.
I think that so this is specifically as a product or how to get it published? Sorry, what was
that whole arena. Basically, we try to keep the podcast focused on actionable game design improvement, and anything outside of that, I'm less comfortable with. So I want to have a dedicated section for it.
Well, if this is the first segment of it, I'll start with some of the low-hanging fruit, which is get out there physically, right? Go to shows, start meeting people in real life. It's not the easiest thing to do, especially if you don't live near a major population center, or it wouldn't be easy to get to a show. But I would say of the games that I've gotten signed, somewhere between 95 to maybe even 100% of them came from the fact that I'm pitching to people that I met in person, at least at some point previously, who I have an established relationship, who know who I am, who know I'm a real person who's serious about game design. it's not to say that you can never get a game published if you just do sort of like a cold submission to a website, but it is a much harder road. So much of our industry is who you know and networking and FaceTime with people and just putting a face to a name. Getting out to a show is the best first step kind of to that world if it's something you're serious about.
I think that's a great tip. AJ, how do you feel about having fun?
I love having fun. Very briefly at the end of each one of our episodes for a very short amount of time, and that's it.
That is the idea. I'm actually a doctor. This never comes up, but I'm a fully trained medical doctor. And I can tell you, as a doctor, that is the correct amount of fun. If you're having any more of that, you will die immediately.
You know, it almost wouldn't surprise me if you were. I was at a family function recently. And I was just talking to them about, like, you know, my story of like work I've gone through and how I've gotten to the place where I am with game design stuff. And like, wow, they should make a movie about you when you get big and famous. I was like, no, if that happens, they're going to do it for my co-designer, not for me.
I think it's definitely be a fascinating subject for a movie. I agree. What's our fun question? Oh, actually, no. Let's talk about this. In a previous episode, I described a toy dragon.
This is going to be the blurriest section. I don't know if it's still that way for you, AJ, but Peter is just like 4 pixels right now. So
Yeah.
we'll have to put a still picture somewhere in the Discord.
In a previous fun question at the end of an episode, I described a toy I had as a child, and Alex, being the sweetest man in the world, went and bought me that toy. So I have a dragon as a direct result of this fun section and also the Harbinger of Death. AJ, take us away.
What is the most fun team you've ever worked with? Alex.
Game design team, I'm assuming?
No. This is a fun question. We're allowed to have fun. It doesn't have to be at work.
Okay. Well, definitely not game design then. Most fun team I've ever been a part of.
Let's say it must not be about game design, because that way we're not going to accidentally step on any toes.
So before I lived in North Carolina, I lived in a few other places, but one of them was Burlington, Vermont, which is a very small city. It's the biggest city in Vermont, but that means nothing. It's like 40,000 people. So it's a small town. And when I moved there, I didn't know anybody, but I wanted to get involved in something socially, right? So I went on meetup.com and made some friends in the area. And it led to me joining a beer league softball team. Which I played a little bit of softball when I was a kid, but not a ton. And so this was very much just like a bunch of guys and girls go out, like once a week, 20 weeks in a row during the season or whatever, and just like literally drink beer and hit softballs and catch them and then go out to dinner afterwards. And I think there's like a league to it where like you're actually trying to win the games. It's not like just total harmless fun, but it's everyone's terrible at it, right? And like me especially, like we're not athletes, right? And we're, at varying levels of drunk probably by the end of it. It was a ton of fun. We were called Skeleton Crew or something. So like we had like the MLB logo, but like as a skeleton on our shirts. And it was just a ton of fun. And it led to some like friendships that I still have to this day. So that would be my fun team that I've been a part of.
Nice.
Back in 2015, I had never left Australia. Never once had I left the country of my birth. And in February, I went to New York for the first time and discovered that America is home, which is the most ridiculous thing to discover as an Australian in my mid-20s. I've never felt as home as I did here. So I stayed for a month, left, and just immediately wanted to come back. It took me 9 years to get my permanent residency. I'm now a permanent resident. Very exciting. Thanks to board games. But when I came back that first time, so not the first trip, but the first time I came back, I went to Chicago and I did, it was called the Improv Olympic, or IO. They did a 6-week summer intensive where over 6 weeks you would do the first 6 levels of their improv program. And normally each of those weeks was a semester because you do it, once a night for 12 nights or whatever, for 12 weeks, 1 night a week for 12 weeks. Instead, they did in 4 days. That's right. So traditionally it would be 8 weeks, 1 night a week. They crammed all of that into 4 days. So the first half of the first day was the first week. The second half of the first day was the second week. And you got split up into sections. So there were, I think, 16 sections, section 1, section 2, section 3. And that was the people who you were with for the entire 6-week program. The person who read out ours somehow messed it up. Instead of saying section 6, they said session 6. And so my answer to this question is session 6, which was this group of maybe 15, 20 of us, I can't even remember now, because I was new to American, enthusiastic and outgoing and all that, I insisted that we, go get to know each other. We started having breakfast together every morning before we went in. Then we'd go in, do the full day. Then most nights we'd go out for a drink. And we had every week with a different teacher. So over the 6 weeks, it was 6 different teachers. I think every single teacher said in the entire time the program has been running, they had never found a group as close as we were.
That's great.
I love those people. I still am Facebook friends with them. I see all their updates. Absolute ball. Absolutely wonderful group. What a lovely question. I didn't have the answer to that. I have all these photos up around my house. If I had more than 4 pixels, you can see that. And I have multiple photos of session 6. AJ.
I feel like I trauma bond a little bit because the 2 that came to mind was one when
running
we
this podcast.
Yeah. When I was a teenager, I was on a missions trip teaching English to, oh my gosh, I'm going to mess it up. Russian-speaking Czechs it was Russian-speaking Ukrainians in the Czech Republic is where we were at when we were teaching English. And that was really intense. Like I was like 16 and didn't know how to be an English teacher. And it was a pretty intense experience for a lot of reasons. But that was a really incredible experience with everybody. And classic AJ, I will give my second answer, which is we were in a drama class, and I was in every single play. I took drama 2 to 3 times a semester out of 4 of my classes. I took more than I was supposed to, I think, but I just maxed out every possible chance. There was almost no drama classes I wasn't in. And so in grade 11, I think it was, I knew everyone from all of the drama things and really well. And we were doing a play that was called The Laramie Project. Have either of you heard of that one?
Yeah.
So for the listeners, it's basically about a small town where a guy is brutally murdered because he's gay. And it's just the people who made the play just went in and interviewed different people around the town for their opinion on what happened. That is all the play. There's absolutely zero commentary from the actual playwrights. It is just monologues from people who were at the town, what they thought on it. It was really intense, really powerful, and as we sort of
it's called
publicized
verbatim theater is the name of that style.
And as we were preparing for it, we started advertising a bit around town that we were putting it on, and Westboro Baptist got wind of us.
No!
And we're going
Please
to
don't
come
tell me
over.
the rest of this question is Westboro Baptist.
No, fortunately they were stopped at the border, but it was it was a very harrowing experience for a lot of us who some of them I think were getting death threats and stuff like that, and it was a pretty intense experience, and we definitely
this is
bonded
so
a lot
fun,
over that.
what a happy, upbeat note.
But yeah, like I said, there's some trauma bonding for sure. But I feel like I've never felt closer to a group of people that I worked with and it was a long period of time that we prepared for that play as well, right? So we all became very, very close, and it was very hard saying goodbye to that class.
I always forget that I bring the fun and you bring the problem. That dynamic escapes me.
By the way, all those Russian Ukrainian Czechs were actually the orphans of murdered. Yeah.
Cool. Well, Alex, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, absolutely.
In 2 years' time, when we realize we can't upload this episode, we'll get you back. And
we're just going to have a series of still shots of me getting grayer and grayer, and the episode never comes out. Yeah.
But no, this is really great. Really appreciate you coming on. How do we normally end these, AJ? I always forget.
You do always forget. It usually ends with you asking me how we end these things.
That's a good recurring bit.
And I say that we don't do the stinger anymore, so you can just say goodbye.
Oh, lovely. Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone. Thanks for joining us. You can follow us on Facebook or Twitter at FunProblemsPod, or reach us via email at funproblemspodcast@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you, and if you enjoyed the podcast, please tell a friend.
Oh, it says trying to reconnect. Can you guys hear me? Yep. No?
Looks like we may have lost Peter again.
Oh, no. Hello?
Was that
Am I back?
10 seconds of robot noises for you too, AJ, or was that just on my end?
Yeah, no, that was me too.
Right,
Hopefully
I'll cut that
it's
out.
all good on his end.
Hopefully. What was the last thing you guys had?
You're still a robot.
Yeah.
Man, now I'm going to have to edit.
You're going to have to do some editing.
Alex, you are a curse.
Can I swear a bunch right now, just really loudly, so you can see where it is in the WAV file?